Right. Can everyone hear me? Good? All right, excellent. So I want to thank everybody for coming out today, bearing the traffic. Um, I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina, so I don't have to hit my brakes as much as I do down there while I'm here. But we fortunately enough Ubered over, and I think that our Uber driver could probably drive NASCAR because he was maneuvering. I always like to start these events with taking a moment of silence to invite emotional intelligence in the room, as well as honoring the individuals in which we're going to be discussing. So if we can just take about 10 seconds, you can close your eyes, however you need to do such, then let's just take about 10 seconds to do that, please. All right, thank you, everybody. Um, I'm going to get this started with a story. Um, the second film that I did, The Other Side of the Coin, Race, Generations, and Reconciliation, started filming that in 2018. And I was identifying various different participants across the country. And I came across an individual, and hopefully he's on watching, who was a reporter, a journalist for the Virginia Pilot. And his name is Bill Sizemore, out of Mecklenburg County, Virginia. And I said, we're both part of a group called Coming to the Table. Has anyone heard of Coming to the Table? By show of hands, right? So I'm like, Bill, I'm doing this film. I would like you to be a part of it. And, said, yes, absolutely. He said, but I have someone else I think that you should meet. I'm like, all right, cool. What? Let me know who it is. And he says, Uncle George Sizemore, same last name, et cetera, et cetera. And he said, but there's something about Uncle George that's really, really special. And I said, okay, well, what's that? And he says, Uncle George is the son of an enslaved individual. So I'm fanning out, right? Like I'm at a rock concert, hip hop concert, like about to meet my favorite artist. And I'm like, you're BSing me. And he was like, no, seriously. Like he is. Like his father was, he was 15 when his father passed. And so me knowing how sometimes elders can be in the community, I'm like, man, did you tell him about me? Because you can't just go up to someone's home and have these types of conversations, especially in the Black community with these oral histories. It's so coveted and so protected. So you have to be very strategic about these things. And here's a guy from Charlotte coming out to rural America and trying to have this conversation with him. He said, yeah, I got you. We're good to go. So it came to film day, had all my questions lined up. Being that I'm a therapist, I always try to also ask the very, very difficult questions as it relates to historical trauma, especially when we're talking about certain populations, of course. And so we get there to the house. This house was built in 1919 or maybe 1909, and it was the house that his father had built post-emancipation. His father was born in 1858. And to my understanding, I think by the time he was 4 years old, he was out laboring. And so we go in there, and Uncle George is sitting down at the table. He has this old, rusty screwdriver in his hand. And I know what all this means, okay? He got the old, rusty screwdriver, and it's like, this is my space. You're going to have to earn your keep around here. And so he's asking questions, and I'm asking him questions, and we all just kind of get out on the front porch and just start having just regular conversation, having a good time. But I knew I was going to have to ask him questions about his father and the institution of enslavement, as well as what he pressed his father for as it relates to information as a child, which already sometimes in the Black community, whenever you're amongst adults, you're told to leave that space, right? And so to think that, man, would he have any information from his father who came from those specific, that came from that specific background? I'm thinking maybe not, but we're going to roll the dice. And so we started talking about various different things about the community in Mecklenburg County, Virginia, its history, Rosenwald schools, churches, et cetera, et cetera. So after I felt like I moved in really good, I'm like, all right, I'm about to go ahead and drop the question. And so I said, your father, to our understanding, he was an enslaved individual. And before I could even say individual, he cut me off and he said he was. And I was like, okay. He wasn't being mean. He was just very matter of fact. It's his family, so he should be, right? And so I asked the question. I said, what was information imparted onto you about his time being an enslaved person? So remember, Uncle George was 15 when his father passed. So, you're not 3 or 4 years old, right? Like you can formulate your words and you have this developed context of information that you would like to receive or things that you may be inquisitive about. And so he got quiet. And for me as a therapist, thank God I knew to kind of fall back a little bit and let him process this, right? Because he's not, those questions aren't asked of him often, right? He was just a stalwart in the community, and people are just more so aware of what it is that he does now. I'm not even sure a lot of people even knew this was part of his history, because it's not like he was standing on top of a roof on a daily basis with a bullhorn saying that I'm a child of an enslaved individual. And so he started coming around talking, and he started saying, well, back in that time, in my youth, people didn't really talk about a lot of things, but I do remember one story that my father told me. And so he's taking little breaks while he's telling us the story. And everyone's captivated because we know it's coming, right? Whatever it is that he's about to tell us, and whatever it is that he's going to tell us, being that it's from the descendant of an enslaved individual, we're treating it as like a newborn, right? We're being very careful. We're using emotional intelligence. We're using empathy. All these things that are nurturing and create this sense of cohesiveness, that we're in support and in allyship with you, and we acknowledge you and your father. And he says the thing that stood out to him, the one thing that his father told him solely about the institution of slavery, is that when his father was 7 years old, he was taken with other enslaved individuals to a tree, to a lynching in the community. And he said that they put the enslaved individuals within the circle, and other individuals in the communities, whites in the communities, were pretty much on the outskirts of the inner circle. And his father had to witness that lynching. And this is a man who served in the military. I'm talking about Uncle George, big guy. I mean, I think Uncle George was like maybe 6'4", 200 plus pounds. And the screwdriver, he had still had it in his hand, but he kind of just dropped it on his leg. And you could just see how much even telling that story took out of him. And he got very, very, very quiet. He didn't tear up or anything like that, but he kind of started looking off into the distance. And I said, I'm going to pull back, and I'm not going to press anymore with that, because I had to take my own ideology of being selfish at that moment out of it, because we may not have been able to finish filming that day, right? I say all that to say that imagine the various different traumatic events that happened in his father's life, how some of that anger, anxiety, frustration, et cetera, may have been displaced in other areas of within the family system. And I'm speculating, I think it would be quite human if that was the case, right? Because what do you do with this displaced frustration, anger, lived experience during that time period? And I said to Uncle George, I greatly appreciate you for sharing that much, and I won't go any further. And he just kind of looked at me and just said, thank you. I say that story. Oh, and also Uncle George died. It was 2021. Uncle George, I believe, passed in 2021. You can look him up, George Sizemore. There's a book that's called Uncle George and Me by Bill Sizemore. Bill wrote this book. But it's trauma that's tied to that. And we, while being there with the cameras on him, with me asking certain questions, I knew I had to trigger that, right? There was no way around it. But I don't think that he would have invited us into his space if he wasn't prepared for that type of questioning, right? And so I say all that to bring it back to today with individuals who have been doing tremendous research within their family units, within their communities, that are, we're looking at individuals that champion the lived experiences of individuals who have been historically oppressed generation after generation after generation. And I just think this is very beautiful that as descendants of individuals who were enslaved, that we're able to gather and create a sense of community here as it relates to our shared experiences from family lineage, but also with individuals in the community, in the audience as well, who may have the same similar experiences, family experiences, or just interested in the topic, so they can gain a better understanding and be more comprehensive as it relates to what chattel slavery was like in the United States of America, right? And so, with that being said, I want to first ask the panel to tell us your ancestral connection to Tudor Place and the Custis Estate, or descendant communities and settlements here within the DC region. And I'll let anyone go. Whoever wants to go first, please do.
Tudor Place, can you hear me? Okay, in terms of Tudor Place, my family is 3 generations living in that structure. So that when I think about that particular place, it is simply one of many locations for my family who was enslaved for 243 years. So, as Frederick has said, there's a lot of anger and pain about slavery. However, more importantly for me personally, and I think for the family, is the brave people, the strong people who survived, who enabled me to be here, my son here, and my granddaughter. This is our story. And all of us who are on this panel over these 200 or 300 years, we're all connected. I mean, directly. There's the Carter connection, there's the Quanda connection, there's the Syphax connection. And these are the names that our ancestors carried. Thank you.
Good evening. My connection to Mount Vernon and to Arlington House is through Charles Syphax and his wife, Maria Carter Syphax. Both of these individuals were owned by George Washington Parke Custis, who was the grandson of Martha Washington. Maria was the daughter of George Washington Parke Custis, through an enslaved woman of George Washington Parke Custis. They were taken to Arlington House after Martha died, and George Washington Parke Custis inherited several dozen enslaved people. From there, he built Arlington House. What most people don't know about the Syphax family, if they know anything at all, is that Charles Syphax was the head butler at the house. He married Maria in 1821. But the interesting thing here is that Maria's half-sister, Mary Custis, married Robert E. Lee in 1831. So the Syphaxes have a connection to the Lee family that can't be broken. Not that we would, but we need to understand and acknowledge that this exists. The other thing I'll say here in terms of my connection is through my direct, Charles Syphax was my uncle, my third great uncle. His sister, Nancy Syphax, was enslaved at the Decatur House, right here in Washington, D.C. She was owned by John Gadsby, but it's amazing how the Syphaxes have been able to stay connected to one another regardless of the distance that exists.
I don't have a direct correlation with the Tudor house, but I have family that were enslaved in Mount Vernon, and they were enslaved at Woodlawn and Woodlawn Plantation. A lot of the remnants of those things, and I live about 1.5 miles from the Mount Vernon estate. You look at it every day. It's not back then, it's still there. And as a young man, I love history, but I never wanted to go to Mount Vernon. I never wanted to go to Woodlawn to visit the plantation. Finally, I found out that I have an obligation to do that. It doesn't matter whether I want to. I have an obligation to do that because I try to tell the story as it is. And there are things that really put chills up and down your spine as you begin to learn some of the things that went on. And that's why I just really thank the world of you people to come out today to share some of these things, because you could have been doing anything you wanted to do today, but you decided to come here and share some of the things that we're going to be presenting to you today. And then talking to this panel, as we've been talking to them, the things that we share, and just something as simple as finding a relative. And realizing how some of the records were kept or not kept. When you down in Mount Vernon, there's one of my relatives was one of my great grandfathers was actually after Washington's death guarded the tomb, and in Sarah Johnson's book of Mount Vernon, they speak of the fact that when he died, after all of the service he did that day, only thing referred to him as the old darky. Now, when you read those things, most of the times you just keep going after a while. But when that's a relative, that's somebody you know, that's somebody that you don't know them personally, but you know them through the years. It's all those things have been passed down to you. You start putting faces with pictures. And when you start looking at things like this slave here is worth $300, this one's worth $700. Well, you got a family, so this is worth $13. If you think about the horrors of all that, and that's only after you get here. It doesn't talk about the middle passage or anything like that. That's after you get here.
Good evening, everyone. I am, again, a descendant of John Luckett, and we are kind of in the beginning stages of unfolding the family tree. And I agree with you. Even now, every time I talk about it, I just get choked up because it's like we're here. And even in today's society, it still feels like we're not here because people push it under the rug. And while he was not enslaved, he still worked at Tudor Place and, took his part in the community. But, Tudor Place is doing a good job of recognizing it. But even today, coming over here to Georgetown, and I visited Georgetown plenty of times because I lived in Washington, D.C., I'm born in Washington, D.C., it still don't feel like we belong here.
Like my cousin said, we were born here. John Luckett, he came from Virginia. During the Civil War, he was enslaved on a plantation in Lewinsville, Virginia. For those that don't know where that is, that's McLean. That's near Tyson's Corner. There's a small park over there that's called Lewinsville Park that's named for that small settlement that's out there that was once known as Lewinsville. During the Civil War, he emancipated himself. He walked from Virginia across the Chain Bridge. There's been a bridge there for the last 2 centuries. He'd never been over here. He walked over here. He walked through Georgetown. He came to Tudor Place. Whatever made Britannia hire him to be the gardener, he became a gardener. He had a house. He had a family. He lived on Capitol Hill. When we talk about Capitol Hill, most people think of the east side of Capitol Hill. On the west side of Capitol Hill, where all those federal buildings are, people once lived there. He walked from that neighborhood to Tudor Place faithfully every day for 4 decades as he worked there. And like my cousin said, we are in the beginning stages of trying to unravel the mysteries of what our family was, how our family got here, because for us, this has been a discovery because a lot of this information was lost to us. And as we make these discoveries, we are trying to educate our descendants and carry on to our future so that they understand the past and not make the same mistakes and provide a better future. Because happiness without a past is happiness without a future.
Thank you all for those introductions as it relates to identifying space and place. I'm going to start, and now I'm going to pick on people, and then after I pick on the first person, somebody can pick up. All right. So Anne, I'm thinking about just the years, over 20 plus years of genealogy research that I've done. Right. Whether it's ancestry, whether it's driving umpteen miles away to go to archives, local libraries, et cetera, to identify resources. What has been you first, your modality in identifying and kind of galvanizing the story of your family history related to the Tudor Place? And if you can also include whether it was oral histories, just independent research, word of mouth, et cetera, that would be excellent. Because real quick, because it's to really get a full comprehensive understanding of what your family lineage is, there's so much that's involved with it financially, emotionally, et cetera, right? So if you can really go in depth as it relates to what your process has been like.
I think that originally, as a child, my family, being my grandfather, my mother, and my aunt, would throw us in the back seat of a car and take us to Mount Vernon twice a year. We as children had no idea why we were going. After the trip to Mount Vernon, where we were instructed to stay out in the yard because we were too rambunctious as kids to walk those in between those ropes as you go through the house, we put back in the car and went to the Custis Mansion. The adults had all the conversation. We had not a clue. I remember at Mount Vernon, it was the first time I had cherry vanilla ice cream. I mean, that was the high point in terms of what I found out later was a family pilgrimage. And the adults had the conversation. So I'm ignorant for the first 20 some years of my life. And then when Tudor Place opened to the public, I asked my aunt, I said, isn't that in Georgetown? And she said, yes, because the family had been in Georgetown. When they left, when they were taken from Mount Vernon, they ended up with the Peter family, and eventually Peter family moved from K Street to Tudor Place. My aunt said, yeah, but she never said anything about our connection to Tudor Place. And then it was open to the public. And I asked her, I said, well, do you want to go there? This is the first time that she says, no, I do not want to go to see where my family was slave, is the term she used. Like, okay. And then she got into a Georgetown history program university was carrying on here for the Black community in Georgetown. And she began talking, and people at Tudor Place contacted her and invited her. She still was resistant, but she decided that she would go. But what she did was ask the whole family to go with her. So it was a buffer, because all these years she had been with the rest of the family, keeping herself separate. That's when I found out that we had a connection to Mount Vernon. So this was not any history that was, in terms of the enslavement, much less any connection to the Peter family directly. You know, all of this is unfolding in the last, for me, well, I'm old now, but last 30 years. So it's not, it's not something, but it was all oral history that comes out slowly, but triggered by what becomes an interest in, quote, American history.
Thank you. Next up.
I'll go. My story is a little bit different than Ann's. I was born and raised in Denver, Colorado. Imagine a teenager, probably around 16, when a cousin began to talk to me about my family history. We would go to church together, our families, and then we would repair to her house where we would probably have lunch, and then she would talk to me about my family history. And one of the first things that she asked me was, did you know that you were connected to the first president of the United States? And as a Black kid, 15 years old in Denver, Colorado, I'm saying inside, get out of here. There is no way. And I asked my mom about that, and she basically said, I am not aware of that. She always had be seen but not heard. She was an only child, so she didn't have a lot of history. So I was pretty much on my own as we began to do this. But what those conversations did with that cousin, her name was Estrelda. Estrelda set me on this 50-year journey that I'm on today. It was a journey to try to decipher fact from fiction, from folklore. And they are all interwoven. And so it's been my quest to figure those things out. And one of the other things that Estrelda told me is that you need to know your history and you need to get to know your relatives. You need to know who they are. You need to speak of your narrative. Well, I needed to figure out what my narrative was. And so for probably 30 years, I worked extremely hard trying to pick apart the Syphax story. We're very lucky in that since the Syphaxes have a connection to the Washingtons, there is a reasonable amount of information. But is that fact or is it fiction? And so part of this was trying to dig between the lines to figure out what is reality. How did my other relatives view this? They have their personal perspective, their personal histories that have to be overlaid on all this. And to try to decipher that and honor their view and to honor how they have been taught about what we have come to be has been a real challenge at times, because at times the fact is in complete conflict with what the folklore says. And so my goal has been to try to speak to our narrative while honoring my cousins and my ancestors, but speaking to how history has written about them and working to reclaim the narrative that perhaps has been written that is incorrect, that needs to be enhanced.
Want to go next? Actually, I'll go ahead. So my story begins in the year 2020. I'm on Ancestry. I'd taken a DNA test. A young woman who lives down in Georgia had reached out to me and asked the question, how are you related to your grandfather? And I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. She said, how do you know anything about your grandfather? And I could tell her nothing. I had never met the man. My maternal grandmother and grandfather both passed away before I was even born. And so that part of my family's history was lost. And then she told me her story. She lived out in Georgia. Her mother was born in DC. She never knew her father. She never knew her mother's father. She was just trying to find her family and asked for my help. So I sat there one day and I said, I don't know what I don't know, and I need to know what I need to know. So with that being said, I decided to go full in and try to figure out my family's history. And one of the discoveries I made was an actual census record where my grandmother was listed in 1920, living with her grand aunt and her mother. And that was all I had. And from there, I started to connect the dots backwards from her mother to her mother's mother, where she actually got her name. Her mother's name was Ruth Luckett. And from Ruth Luckett, I was able to discover Charles Edward Luckett and his family. And I connected them to John Luckett. And as I was researching John Luckett, I found one small obituary that listed him as the gardener of Tudor Place for 44 years. And I sat on that information for a minute because as you're doing research, you're going through different branches, you're going back and forth and back and forth. And then one day I found another obituary that was actually written by the grandchildren of Britannia Peter King, where they adored him. They talked about things they did around the house with him. And then I found a third obituary where I don't know who it was written by, but there was a picture of John Luckett in the newspaper attached to that obituary. And when I saw that, a lot of emotion came over because we're talking about a person who was born in the 1840s, that lived in the late 19th century, that died in the early 20th century. And here I am staring at a man to whom I am related that I never in my life thought that I would see. You have no idea the amounts of emotion that came over me, joy, tears, amazement, that I was able to actually go through this in a matter of a year to make these connections. My wife will tell you that because I actually shared this with her and she was just amazed that I actually found this information through all the work that I had been doing, because I had done a lot and I'm still working on it today. But as I gathered that information, one day out of the blue, the curator of Tudor Place, Rob DeHart, contacts me and asks me a question. And we started to compare notes and verify. And I had no idea what Tudor Place was at that time. I mean, I knew it was there, but I didn't know exactly what it was. And then when he broke it down to me, it just another whole rush of different emotions just came over me. And from there, the first time I came to Tudor Place, walking up the street, going to the house, knowing that my great-great-great-grandfather walked this same street during the late 19th century, going to work, it was just surreal. It brought so many emotions. I mean, every time I told a story to someone, I get the same sense of these emotions that come over me. And it's just, it's hard to actually put into words. It's just a thing. It's a sense of discovery because, like I've said, all of this was not known to us because my grandmother's grandparents, the son of John Luckett, passed away before she was even a year old. So a lot of this information about John Luckett as a man was lost to our family. We had no idea.
So then I'll just, piggyback on what Carl has said, because discovery, he'll call me and say, hey, God, what you know about? I'm like, I don't know. Well, tell me what you know about. So again, we've been taking this walk together, and it is still like overwhelming because as a kid, I love coming to Georgetown. And you know, as things unfold, I understand why. I spent a lot of time in Georgetown in my early teens. Didn't do all the shopping. I'm attracted to water. So we would just be on the waterfront and down on the canal, just enjoying the scenery and being kids. But, you know, as this Carl said, when Rob contacted him, the staff at Tudor Place and the folks at Tudor Place was just it was so heartwarming for them to like welcome us in. But then it was like we did a reality check. Like, this man was the gardener here, and the gardening is the grounds there itself is beautiful, but I had to just stop for a minute. Even today, when I pulled up, I just stopped for a minute and gave honor to all of those that was enslaved at the property. You know, knowing that all of us was coming here to tell a piece of our story, it says a lot. That Tudor Place is keeping enslaved people, families alive today. And the fact that people are coming out to hear our story. So it's like, what more is there to be done? And, you know, Frederick and hearing his story and his enthusiasm to bring it out of us. It's like, we would always wonder, do people even really care? If we don't care, who else cares or not?
We were doing family reunions, and we were doing the history, and they gave me a little book. This was years ago, and said, this is the family history that we're going to do this, and see what you can do to add to it. So, and this was, well, I looked at that, and I'm going to get straight to the story I'm talking about. My great grandmother was the first of two wives. And this woman had 16 children. The second wife had none. Now, if you look at all of the family history up to that point, the only person that they knew about was the second wife. And through research, once we found out that she mothered all of these kids, and there's no mention of her in that history whatsoever. And once we started talking about it more and looking at the census records and things of that nature, which spells it right out. And I know some of them worked at the mansion, but Washington had 5 farms. You might have been anywhere. Whether they need you, if they couldn't afford you to feed you or clothe you, they like to have you working somewhere else on one of them other farms. So you probably got relatives all over the place. And if somebody tell you, I think you related to me, you probably are. And the other thing too, when you're telling some of these stories or you directing people to some of these places, you want to make sure they really want to know. Because sometimes they really don't want to know. Because I mean, I was hit with some shocking stuff of my own, and I'm going like, okay, if I want the truth, you know, I can deal with it. But it was shocking. But to have this woman that gave birth to all of these kids was that important part of the family, and we wonder why all the way down the line there was a Julia, all the way down Julia. You know, but they use the same names over and over and over again, and that was an honorable thing, and that kept family together. But this woman was not even mentioned in any of our family history up to that point.
You know, I'm thinking back what it was like for me to step foot on the Talley Plantation in Warren County, North Carolina, and the feeling that I had that came over me after doing all of this research from Tennessee to, I was living in Atlanta, driving up to North Carolina, because I just had a feeling that was where it was at, because that was the concentration of tallies that were there after leaving Virginia. So in 2019, the year before the pandemic, I had been to the plantation prior to and met with the current owner. The home was built in the mid 1700s. It's in disrepair at this point. It would just need to be knocked down. But I remember how it felt for me to be there, right? And then in 2019, I was able to orchestrate a family reunion on that site. Even though the building was terrible and you can't go in it, but you can go on the first floor. I cleared the land with a couple of other relatives, and we set up tents, and we had the reunion there at that site, right? And so there were a lot of tears. There were, I wish that this person was here to be here. I wish that person was here to, it was just this big old moment in which because we've been having family reunions since the early 1900s of the ancestors that we knew were from North Carolina, and to be there was a very surreal moment. Like you mentioned, there's a lot of emotions that came about. So I'm curious for each one of you, when you first stepped foot on the places in which your ancestors were enslaved, what were those raw emotions? What were those feelings when you left? How was it? Were you able to get sleep that evening? Or was it difficult for you to sleep? Or did you stay up all night and get back on Ancestry or whatever resource that you utilized to research it even more? Did it re-energize you? I'm just curious. And Steve, we'll start with you.
Well, I've got a couple of things to relate in this space. The first one, I'll talk about Nancy Syphax there at the Decatur House. Nancy was owned by John Gadsby, I think I said earlier. She had a daughter around 1818. And we believe that daughter her name was Margaret, was sold in 1831 to a broker like Armsfield and Franklin. She was taken from Nancy. She was sold down to New Orleans. We're still trying to figure out Margaret's story in terms of how she got from Virginia, DC to New Orleans. Trauma there for everybody. It's still trauma for me today to think about how she might have been transported from one point to another. She go by boat? Was she forced to walk? What could have been her life? The other thing that I wanted to relate to you is about Maria Custis and her birth. She was born of a relationship between George Washington Parke Custis and an enslaved woman. The sexual exploitation that took place here had an impact on everybody. We are genuinely pleased to be in this space, but at the same time, this trauma took place with no relationship that we are aware of. And to have it not be recognized for so long that this occurred is still traumatic today. The third thing that I'll share with you is that Maria, after she was married to Charles Syphax in 1821, she had a couple of children. She had a total of 10 children. The first two were born enslaved. And our folklore basically said that George Washington Parke Custis freed her and gave her 17 acres of property. Well, the truth of the matter is he sold her to a Quaker in Alexandria, Edward Stabler. You may know the Stabler Apothecary Shop. That's who he sold them to. He actually freed them. She got the 17 acres of property. But in 1861, when the Civil War started, Robert E. Lee leaves Arlington. Life starts to change in this space. And in 1863, the tax laws change. They require people living in the South, Virginia is in the South at that point, to pay their property taxes in person. The house had turned over because George Washington Parke Custis died in 1857 to his daughter, Mary. It's Mariah's half-sister, and she was married to Robert E. Lee. When the Lees fled, the tax laws changed. The federal government seized the property. They seized the Arlington estate, but they also seized the Syphax property. They became squatters on their own space. The good news is that they got that property back after their oldest son, William Syphax, worked with Congress to pass a bill on behalf of his mother to get it returned. Great story. 1844, Syphaxes are still living on this property. The federal government decides they want to expand Fort Myer, and they condemn the property that the Syphaxes had. So the Syphaxes were forced to move. They were given a small pittance in terms of, compensation. But I share this story because that too is trauma. Not trauma once, but twice. Here's a family who fought to get their property back. The Congress passed a law that said that this property was theirs. And 60 years later, it's taken again by the same federal government. These stories are not being shared. We want to lift up all of our ancestors so that people understand the trauma that exists as a result of these things that happen as snapshots in their lives, and how we as descendants choose to honor them for the perseverance that they had to live through that so that we can be here today.
You're busy.
Busy. Very busy. Happily busy.
No, when you first stepped foot on at Arlington.
How did I feel?
Yes.
It was visceral. I mean, these people were not my direct line, but I channeled them. I felt them in that space. When I took the first tour through Arlington House, I saw Maria and Charles being married in the parlor. When I took a trip down to the south end of the Arlington estate where the 17 acres are, and I could see the wall, I get choked up talking about it because I care so much. After having a conversation with a senior cousin who lived in that 17 acres and remembered playing on the wall in that space, to be down there in that space, so close, but not being able to touch it, extremely frustrating and traumatic for me in terms of trying to live and understand what these ancestors had to deal with. The other thing was walking through the Cater House with my third great grandmother, Nancy, to think that her daughter was sold perhaps right there. We have been to the Cater House, but there's a Carriage House. But Gatsby was known to be a slave trader. He could have easily sold Margaret back there behind the Carriage House, or he could have sold her in Lafayette Square in front of the White House. So thinking about how my second great grandmother got from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans and lived perhaps as a prostitute, a fancy girl in New Orleans, extremely traumatic for me as we think about how this space existed.
Would anyone else like to share their experience?
I'd just like to say that in Old Town, Alexandria, one of the slave pens is still there. And it's right by the King Street Metro. And we think about that, it's really not that long ago, but it's still there. Mount Vernon, it's not only it's still there, but there are stories of when they did the boat rides up and down the Potomac and going to places like Marshall Hall and stuff like that. They had a black boat and a white boat. The white boat could dock in Mount Vernon, but the black boat couldn't dock in Mount Vernon, and they did all the work there. So those types of things. And then last year, the Gulf Springs Historic Society And most of these people were, a lot of these people were on one of these five farms in Washington, had their dinner. They had their black tie dinner at Mount Vernon. And as I'm looking around, I tell my wife, I say, there's something here that's strange to you. We're sitting here at Mount Vernon. I didn't really want to go, but part of what I had to do. And we're being served by white people. But it was a very nice affair, and I think we're going back this year. But there are so many things like that are still here, and then we get to these points in life where we don't want to really talk about history, and we have to tell our history. Nobody can tell it like us. We were, as I'm quite sure most of us here on this panel, when we was coming up, if we would ask a question like that, they would probably tell you that kids don't need to know that, or you know, we don't talk about those sorts of things. And as soon as they say we don't talk about those sorts of things, that's the truth.
Yeah.
Seen but not heard.
Yeah.
There are three things that I said I had emotional response in space. One was on one Tudor Place. I asked if I could go up in the attic because that was where my family, the women, lived. They were nursemaids. That was their sleep space. So that if they were not on the floor in the nursery where the children slept, they were upstairs. And I got up there and I thought about the fact that in the summertime, hot as hell.
Mm-hmm.
In the wintertime, freezing cold.
Mm-hmm.
That was their room. The experience of going to Mount Vernon, went to Dode Run because that was where Sal Twine, my fifth great grandmother, and her children lived while her husband worked on the mansion farm. I stood there after leaving the mill. There's no trace, absolutely no trace of them. But I know that's where they were. And it's as if when we're trying to tell our story, to find evidence of our ancestors, so much imagination is required.
Yeah.
But imagination linked, as you said, with trauma, with separation. You know, we have oral history that Sal was branded on the face. And I was telling Mr. Carter that. You only, as a woman, get branded for one of two things. You are repeatedly trying to run away, and you've been unsuccessful and caught, or you have too much mouth and you are resistant. And that oral history is passed down in my family. But when I ask the scholars and the research people at Mount Vernon, they go, oh no, there's no history of this. Well, of course there's no history. You know, would you record the abuse? But I think probably it didn't happen at Mount Vernon. It probably happened to Sal before she got to Mount Vernon. She was on a Custis property. Mm-hmm. So all of these stories that we have, all these sensations that we experience, we are creating as well as using documentation. I just learned recently that the original photograph of my great-grandmother was found in one of the Peter Descendants homes, and she put everything in a box and said to the Tudor Place people, you can go through this and see if you want anything. Otherwise, throw it out. This is my great-grandmother's picture. And on the back, there's reference that she was Britannia's slave. And Britannia sold her to the neighbor so that she could marry my great-grandmother. I mean, all of these things, you know, every bit of it is about our lives, but it also has that tinge of real pain.
It's funny, Anna, you said that because on our visit here, Rob told us about the box and the photo, and we went in his office and we could see where he was getting ready to start the research for your family. So I got excited, you know, to be able to be into the place and to go down to see the archives. It's just amazing. But when I walked up and I just looked up at, you know, the building itself and how it's made. And even though John Luckett kept up the grounds, he had some handiwork doing with his hands. I wonder, what else did he do at this property? They said he was the gardener, but they have a photo of him standing in front of the property. So for him to be able to take a photo in front of the property and they still have it and they posted it, it's like, what else did he do here? You know, because he had to be a handyman if he was considered just the gardener. But walking through and just the view, I stopped and just wondered, like, what direction did he come from, or which direction did he go for him to have walked from Capitol Hill, which I work in the area where he walked from, to Georgetown. And I just would wonder, like, what route did he take? So I just stood there looking through the trees and the bushes, because we know back then all of these buildings weren't here. And then I took my shoes off. I took my shoes off and walked on the grounds to get that sense of touch of what we don't know. Because it wasn't just him, it was the other descendants and others that walked the grounds. And then, you know, to hear the connection to the Washington family. Not long after that, I went over to Mount Vernon because we went to church. I go to church in that area. So I just pulled up at a park and I just looked, watched the boats coming up and down. And it's just amazing, again, how we're all connected some kind of way. It's just like now we're in neighborhoods. You know, we have kids, we don't have kids, but it's like some kind of way you're connected if you just start a conversation with people, and Tudor Place has done that for us.
The first time I walked up to Tudor Place, it was amazing. I'm going to say that because, like my cousin, I'd spent a lot of time walking around DC. I've walked around the mall. I've walked through different parts. I used to hang out in Northwest, used to hang out down here. Family grew up in Southwest and Southeast for decades. So I parked a good ways away. I didn't park at the property. So I actually started walking potentially a street that John Luckett may have walked on his way to work. And as I'm walking up the hill, coming to the main gate, and I'm just trying to get a sense of what he saw, what he smelled, what he felt as he walked from Capitol Hill to Tudor Place, rain or shine. And you had to put yourself in the mindset The streets weren't asphalt, they were cobblestone. There were no sidewalks, traffic lights, or anything of that nature. You have to put yourself in that space. And as I'm putting myself in that space, and I'm thinking, wow, this man literally walked across the city. And most people think of DC. DC is not, it's a small city, but it's not a small city when you're on foot. And you have to think about it as you're walking from F Street Southwest, coming over here to 31st Street Northwest in DC. You're cutting through the mall, which was just mud back then. You're cutting up Pennsylvania Avenue. You're coming across Rock Creek. However it was he came to get here, I'm thinking about that. And as I stand at the gate, I stood there for a minute and I just was overcome with so much emotion. There was this sense of discovery. There was this sense of, how did you do this day in and day out? And I just the words, I couldn't put the words together. There's just the feeling that I had. And then as I stand there and I'm looking at the house and I'm thinking to myself, he looked at this house every day. He stood on these grounds every day. There are trees that are on the property that I'm doggone sure that as the gardener, he tended to them and he planted them day in and day out. Stand there and I'm looking out and I'm, like my cousin said, I'm thinking, how did he get, which ways did he come? Did he take the same way every day? Did he take a different path? The staff at Tudor Place prepared something different for us. We didn't actually take the house tour. They actually have some of John Luckett's tools still on the property. And one of the things that I discovered about John Luckett that I didn't know from the staff at Tudor Place is my great-great-grandfather was a lefty. All of his tools were set up for a lefty. That was something that's very unusual because there is one lefty in the family and I'm sitting right next to him. But that was another connection that we did not know. I mean, this is stuff that, like I said, was lost to us through time. But you sit there and you think about, you're trying to visualize where he walked from because you can't go there anymore. F Street has been completely demolished. F Street is now I-395, the Southeast Southwest Freeway. Doesn't exist anymore. When John Luckett passed in 1906, this is, I'm gonna bounce here in a little, I'm gonna bounce back a little bit. So when he passed away in 1906, he was buried in Columbia Harmony Cemetery in DC. For those that don't know, this is another piece of that generational trauma that we talk about.
Yes.
So Columbia Harmony Cemetery was raised and moved in the mid-20th century. It was relocated out to Landover, Maryland. John Luckett's grave has been lost to us because they didn't keep the bodies with the headstones. So anyone that wants to go visit John Luckett's grave, you can't because no one knows exactly where it is. Where Columbia Harmony Cemetery now sits is now the Rhode Island Avenue Metro Station and the shopping center adjacent to it, along with that post office. But that's, for us, that's another piece of that generational trauma because when we were growing up and when we moved, our family moved to Landover, Maryland, we lived a stone's throw from that cemetery. And to now know this information just adds to that trauma that we feel because now you know you have a family member that was buried there that you can never actually go stand in front of their headstone and say thank you for surviving so that we can be here today.
I'm gonna add to that in thinking about that walk, because if you are here in DC, you know that there's southeast, northeast, southwest, northwest. If he lived in southeast, he had to trek through every section of DC before he reached northwest. And I always get people, when we are talking about the Capitol, because if you've ever been to the Capitol, depending on where you are, you could touch every sector of town from the Capitol. And where he stayed faced the Capitol. So I kind of imagine him coming that direction, northeast, southeast. From southeast, you could either touch northeast or southwest before you even get to northwest. So to know that, me even, like I said, I work up on Capitol Hill in that area. I still sometimes have that touch, that feel, that I have family that's walked through here. In some of that area, they're still trying to preserve like the cobblestone streets, but like he said, it was no walk in the park, so to speak, back then, when you're walking miles just to go to work. And you get here, you get there, and you go to work after you just trekked all those miles. Yeah.
And prior to us coming here, we were sitting at the table, we were talking about, there wasn't any New Balances or Hokas or Nikes back then. So, you imagine making that trek on a daily basis, rain, sleet or snow, sunny, to do that type of work, which is extensive work. And then, trekking back home to your family, day in and day out, because the interesting piece about John Luckett is he chose to stay living in his community. So this wasn't a situation where you had the sharecropping system or the tenant farming system in some of the lower southern or more rural areas where people stayed on the property to take care of the grounds. This guy said, I'm going back to my community and going back to my home with my family, because that in itself was the second wave of enslavement to a certain degree, because there were various different systems that were put in place that would continue, if you were on that property, of course, to create a sense of oppression. And then, so good for him, right, for making that and utilizing that newly found autonomy to say he wanted to do that. And you have a very interesting history, again, to the Tudor Place, because you're not only connected to the enslaved individuals, but via DNA, you're also connected to the enslavers.
Right.
When that information was found, right, when you discovered that, tell us how that resonated with you.
Well, of course, I did the Ancestry DNA. I did the Ancestry.com because I wanted to know my African nations. I was not really interested at all in the European. And I got an email from one of the Peter descendants. And she said, you have come up as either my third or fourth cousin. And I hope you aren't offended or put off by my reaching out to you. And I went, no, I mean, look at me. It's not a secret that I have other than African in me. We also knew that Britannia, when describing my great-grandmother, said that she was not a pure negress. Well, of course not. It was her niece, her brother's child. I think that most people of African descent who live in this country, when they talk about biracial, what does that mean? I mean, almost all of us, even if we think that you're white, your family is connected and related to people of African descent. I mean, that's just a matter of fact. until the 1830s, this was a land of Black and brown people with a small population of European women. Almost all the children born until 1830s were mothered by African women, no matter who the father is. So no, it wasn't a surprise. It was that now science is acknowledging what all of us have always known. It's not a surprise.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing those sentiments. You know, when I think about historical trauma, and what, of course, has been passed down from generation to generation via epigenetics, vicarious trauma, and just all of these different iterations of it. I'm curious to each one of you, or whoever would like to discuss this piece with some of the progressions that have been made in this country due to the advocacy, people of color, wanting equity and equality and fighting for it, inclusion, et cetera, et cetera. Do any of you feel that trauma has subsided in some areas versus others as you consistently do this type of research, living in present day? If there is any moments to where you're comparing now versus then, I'm just curious if you feel that holistically you are in a better place now than maybe previously in life, or do you feel that everything that your ancestors have experienced, it still resonates deeply with inside each one of you holistically, but it's been manipulated and it looks different than what it looked like back then?
Yes. I think trauma is still there. I think that the way we try to engage with society, we tend to tamp down those things so that we can deal with day-to-day life. But the trauma and the history and the impact is still there. When you think about the fact that there is a wealth gap, when you think about the fact that we're light skin versus dark skin, and it's around us. It's a part of our fabric. And the fact that we are able to talk about it only exacerbates the fact that we're not willing to acknowledge and to work with it so that we can heal. And that's one of the things that we're trying to do, is create space for conversations so that we can work to heal and repair and move on to things that we can constructively do together.
To piggyback off of what Stephen is saying, when you talk about history is looking into the past and trying to understand. Everything about history is not going to make you feel good at all. If your view of history and everything you see in history is making you feel good and makes you not feel any sense of bad or any dread, it's not history, it's propaganda. You have to take the good with the bad, no matter what, because you can't move forward until you deal with every side of the equation. And that's just the thing, is you can't look at the darkness of slavery. You can't look at the darkness of involuntary servitude. You can't look at the darkness of segregation, Jim Crow, the things that have happened in the past, and just ignore it. You have to confront it. You have to deal with it. You have to talk about it. Because by not talking about it and ignoring it, you bury it in deep, and it causes things to happen inside you that you don't even realize are happening to you. And until you start to deal with it, you can't move forward.
Yeah, and I would piggyback on that to say, when people talk about healing and reparation, the first step is truth telling.
Yes.
I mean, I don't think that if you can't do that, nothing else is going to happen. You know, talking about coming to the table, talking, it has to be truth. My truth may be different from your truth. But truth telling has got to occur. I don't see how you move beyond that to heal or to reconcile without acknowledging, you know, people say this isn't a racist country. For me, that's BS. If it weren't a racist country, why would the data in terms of wealth, economics, health, education, why are these huge gaps existing? What are you going to put it on? You know, this country has not been about equality and justice. When I was a teenager, you know, my father got a call from the principal of the high school. And she said, you have to talk to Ann. She's not pledging allegiance during the morning pledge. And my father went, okay. So I came home that day. I went to all girls school, high school. My father sat me down and he said, I want you to be real clear. When you are pledging allegiance in the morning, it is not to this country as it is. It is you are pledging allegiance to one day it will be the ideals of life, liberty, and justice. And I guess that's enabled me to do the work I do now. Because I'm working towards that ideal, towards that truth telling, rather than swallowing whole this misinformation and propaganda that is spreading across this country. I'm going to say, you know, we're headed, if we don't, to fascism. It's pure and simple. And if you can't see history repeating itself, you're blind.
You know, when, you know, obviously the word trauma has come up numerous times, and when I talk with my therapist friends or when I'm in various different groups, one of the things that we talk about is that, you know, one of the key healings of trauma is actually feeling safe, right? Or healing from trauma, that you have to feel safe, right? If you don't have a safe space to discuss, to feel genuine and authentic as it relates to what it is that you've experienced or previous generations experienced, the likelihood of you moving the needle forward is very slim. So when we talk about melanated people in this country, it's very, as it relates to a moment of reprieve and safe space, I'm not quite sure that that's ever existed. When we talk about the transatlantic slave trade, when we talk about the institution of slavery, and then when the institution of slavery ended, then, you know, Reconstruction, and then, you know, there's this glimpse of hope. Have people in politics. You know, these settlements have been created, and there's this progression that we're starting to see. People are able to ride the trolleys together, able to, they're farming next to each other, right? Paid, et cetera. But then, of course, you have the Black codes and everything that starts coming in. The rise of the Klan starts right back up, right? And these different type of politics come back into play. You know, when we talk about Wilmington, what happened in 1898, that pretty much set the tone as it relates to what it is that you can do to Black and Brown communities from that point forward, right? And then you go into the 1906 massacres in Atlanta, right? The most recent was 1985 with bombs literally being dropped on homes in Philadelphia, right? Tulsa, Lakewood. I mean, there's just been so many of these. It's countless, right? And so throughout that time period, there has never really been a moment of reprieve to where a person can say, I can actually consciously feel that I'm safe and I can maneuver in the world the way in which I would like to maneuver in the world. It doesn't matter how my hair looks, doesn't matter if I speak the proper kings and queens English. None of those things matter. It doesn't matter where I'm from. It doesn't matter if my hair is curly or not. I'm able to be my true authentic self on a daily basis, whether that's in the grocery store, whether that's in certain neighborhoods, whether it's in certain restaurants, sporting events, and so forth and so on. College campuses, right? And so when those things have not been accomplished, right, you have to ask yourself, how can a person who has all of these previous compounded traumas that have been carried through the same experiences, they may just look a little bit differently, how can a present day feel as if they can move past that? If right now we say, okay, we're laying everything out on the table and there's equitable opportunities, resources across the board, there's no more discrimination ever again in life. It would probably take about 3 generations for that to actually be felt. 3 to 4 generations before that to actually be measured based on the people in which we still have here today, right? It's deep. It really is deep, right? And so, it's our responsibility to be conscious about making sure people are able to function in their true authenticity and be their genuine self and embrace them as that, because that's what part of people's healing really does look like. If I can't wear a certain type of thing because of the simple fact, like for instance, I was working at a space and I was wearing my shirt, which is an HBCU shirt, Tennessee State, and I was questioned about it. And I think they were kind of making fun. So you went to UT. You went to UT, right? I'm like, this shirt clearly says Tennessee State. Yeah, the one in Knoxville, right? So we had to go at it, right? Because you were intentionally disrespecting this historically Black college and university in which I attended. And so I was upset about it for a moment, but I can handle myself. I'm independent. I can handle myself, and I handled the situation. But it's just those little things in which you can't even wear a shirt that you went and that you're proud of because you went and you're educated and you're just representing that school without it being questioned, right? Okay. But these are the things in which we have to be conscious about on a daily basis, right? And when we talk about the subject of fairness or not, no, it's not necessarily fair. We go and we pay taxes and we deserve to be in spaces just like anyone else, right? But those are things that do come up on a consistent basis. So I know that we have to wrap up here. I did have a couple other questions, but hopefully they may be asked with you all in the audience participating, right, with the Q&A. So Rob, did you want to lead that or?
We're not part of the conversation, right? You didn't know, the connection between Alberta and Tudor Place. And obviously, like your granddaughter was here and your son, that's how you're not hearing for putting everyone in the conversation. Why did your family, why did they not want to share?
Well, there are a couple of things. I mean, number one, I think that elders on one level wanted to protect us from the history of racism and slavery. I mean, I think that's one part of it. Another part is that those children who come out of the unions are not recognized, acknowledged fully, so that, I mean, how many families, even today, don't recognize children out of wedlock or the second or third families? I mean, it's all of that wrapped in, but I think also it's your family choosing to define itself as opposed to within the confines of slavery. You know, and as you know, we were talking, and I'm thinking, I can say publicly today, because of research and scholars, that in the 19th and 20th century, I had relatives who were lynched, male and female. Is that what I'm going to harp on with my godchild or my granddaughter? Is that going to be the focus of my family history? Or am I going to talk about, you know, the doctors and the teachers and the community people who I know who sustained us, who are members of my family? I mean, you make some choices about the story you tell about yourself. Not that you ignore.
Good evening. Your question is very important because I think it's important to look at this audience. I see some seasoned faces that I've known for a while, and I see my relatives here too. But I think you must understand there is a huge cultural, you can hear me all right with this microphone? There's a huge cultural divide that we haven't harped upon tonight. And part of that is that we were brought up in the African-American community that certain things are not readily accessible to us as a group of people. And that non-access has cast a pall or set a tone over much of our interactions in terms of what we can do in the community at large, who we interact with, and how we must comport ourselves at all times. And I think that this overlay characterizes so much of what we have done. And it's only since, say, Roots that came out of with Alex Haley and some of this began to open up and loosen things in our societies, where we began for the first time to speak of that which was not to be spoken of and said that was not to be told. I remember as a child, my great aunt, I lived with my grandmother, but my great aunt lived with us. And I would ask her, and she talked so much about her grandmother, Mary Ellen. And I would say, well, what about your grandfather? We don't want to talk about that. I didn't find out why, because Mary Ellen was the enslaved woman. And the great grandfather, who identified only as Grandpa Frazier for identification purposes, was a white man. So these were the types of things that the families would not talk about. And consequently, in many cases, it got lost. We are very blessed because we're all from this area. I'm a Mount Vernon part too, Quanta. But we have a long history that we are digging out, and we have to dig very hard because those who knew those secrets that they would not share, many of them took it with them. But these forums, and I look at this audience and I see the general age of this audience, things are changing for the better. I'm a licensed certified tour guide. And when I ask and take my groups around town, 60 years old, how many of you knew about Black people built the core of this original city? I get one or two hands. I say that around 5th graders, 8th graders, I get half. So it's changing. But this is why we are here, because of what they have to say is so very important that you have to learn and go out and share with those who did not have the privilege of being with us here this evening. That's what I want to say. Thank you. We have time for one more question. Would you?
Hi, this is probably a short question, but for Miss Ann, you were sharing about a family picture that was found. I'm curious, are there, like, what does it look like to get that back if you wanted it, or other artifacts that are found that might be family heirlooms?
Well, we have some items that I think came from Tudor House, which were wedding gifts, I assume. And so those are spread among the descendants. That picture, I was talking about it, in fact, today with relatives. In order for it to be safe in terms of curating, we have agreed, even though I haven't had this discussion with Mark, at all, it can stay at Tudor House. Because I am concerned that otherwise it may go in a folder, in a cabinet, it might get lost. What I also want, and that's from both Tudor Place, Mount Vernon, and any other historic place, is a commitment from them that they will value and preserve what they have of ours. And I know there's a big hassle with Harvard right now in terms of images. You have to make decisions about what's the end goal here. And if you're equipped to do the proper curating, that's one thing. But I don't think my family is. We have a copy. We know where the original is. It's at Tudor Place. So that's where I'm.
Thank you. I've learned that when you get the answer you want, it's time to quit. So thank you, Ann, for those words. Thank you, all of you. This has been an amazing experience. Frederick, thank you so much for keeping the conversation going so well. You've given us a great deal to think about, and certainly this is going to guide the work that we're continuing to do and that we are committed to at Tudor Place. I do want to express just a quick word of thanks to the Tudor Place staff who really worked together to make this event a success, and particularly Rob DeHart, our curator, who has spearheaded this entire lecture series, but particularly this program this evening. So thank you so much, Rob. Our landmark lecture series, we have one more program. I want to extend an invitation to all of you on November 7th. Dr. Crystal Moten, the curator of collections and exhibitions at the Obama Foundation, will discuss her work focusing upon the intersection of race, class, and gender to uncover the hidden histories of Black people in the Midwest. And this program will be at 6:30 back at the Dower House at Tudor Place, and that's on the 7th of November. And I also just want to extend an invitation to all of you that if you like what we're doing at Tudor Place, you want us to continue to do those things, we have an opportunity for you to support us through your membership. There's membership information that's out on the reception table. So that's also an inducement to go out to the reception. So just a reminder, we will have a reception for a few minutes out in the lobby area. So we hope that you'll stick around for a few minutes with us to have something cold to drink and a snack and an opportunity for us to continue this conversation. And I want to close kind of bouncing off something that Ann had shared, and it's a quote from James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So Thank you all for being here. Thank you, those of us who are joining us through the live stream, and we hope to see everyone on November 7th at our next lecture. Thanks.